Okay, very good morning on my behalf too. We are continuing today's program with a panel, a very traditional panel. We planned the panel so that, first of all, would like to welcome the panelists, Marc Leunis from Belgium, Giovanna Barzano from Italy, Olof Johansson from Sweden, Eszter Salamon, presenting the European Parental Association, Chris Harrison, European School Head Association, Jörgen Lindholm from ETUCE, and of course Jacky and Mika, who gave us fabulous presentations earlier this morning. And we will now work so that we will get about 3-minute comments, maybe even questions from each panelist, and then we will give an opportunity to Jacky and Peter to reply to those comments and questions. And from there on, the floor is open to all of us to take part. Have comments and questions to the panelists. Okay? And we will start with 3-minute comments first. Giovanna, could you start, please?
I think these presentations were really interesting, very involving and reaching hints and suggestions for our work. If I see them from a policymaker viewpoint, I am intrigued by a few things about all. I would like to tackle the notion of complicity that Jacky mentioned about our need to break the complicity in inequality, to think of how to reverse it. Because I think that in this presentation the notion of complicity was only presented as something which should be overcome and broken, and the need for sensitivity on the part of a teacher towards this complicity, which may appear hidden inside the most, the smallest things of the school life. In your presentation it was tackled from the viewpoint of something which should be broken. But I would also like to ask you if you see the complicity, a reverse of this complicity, a complicity directed towards the need of creating equality as an important aspect. And I would, as far as Peter's presentation, I would be very interested in exploring the notion of differences between schools and within schools that he mentioned. Because I think that there is an enormous difference between these two kinds of differences, to the extent that the differences between schools would lead us to think that it is important that there is a difference between head teacher styles. If there is a relevant difference between schools, part of this difference could be related to different leading styles. On the contrary, the differences within schools would lead us to think that maybe the action of the head teacher has not as much impact as we would like, because if there still are so many differences within the school, there is a lot of space to work, a lot of work to do on the part of the head teacher. So I would like to explore. I was very intrigued by these two things among the others.
Thank you, Giovanna. We take the whole round and then answer. Let's see how it goes.
I also enjoyed both keynotes. I have two remarks or comments. First on equity. In Flanders, we've been struggling with it for over decades. I think like most countries in Europe. And in the past, we tried to solve it with positive financial stimulation. Like Peter said, sort of the free school meals in England in France is based on socio-economic status of the children and the background. Sort of indicator that gives a school more funding if the child applies to that indicators. But Jacky said that there is an unconsciousness in teacher behavior towards children. And we've been trying in Flanders is to get more different sorts of teachers into the schools. So there are not a lot of, let's say, migrants who apply for the teacher occupation. How do you see that? And towards Peter, the learning leadership is something we are recently trying to establish in Flanders also. And mainly the peer support. We tried a few years ago to encourage schools to form school communities to work together within a region. And it was seen as a means to support each other. Mainly the leaders, but also the teachers, but mainly the leaders, to exchange expertise and support. And how that reflects to what you are seeing in England or else in Europe.
I'm not going to reflect separately to the two keynote presentations, especially because both of you called parents as kind of obstacles in many cases, and of course as main decision makers that I think I've mentioned yesterday. And from both of your presentations, I feel that for this kind of approach, it is very important to do real good PR jobs for school leaders, policymakers, and all those parents and even students who are happy with such solutions to promote the idea, because I think that it's a very big problem for these new ideas, because they cannot really be measured immediately. I mean, the success of these new leadership styles, management styles cannot really be measured immediately. It can be measured in 10 years' time when we see that the students who went to schools that were led by good school leaders achieved their life potential or not. And for that reason, you have to persuade parents to make the decision to send their children to schools that are led by real good school leaders, even if they look like something completely different from the school idea that they have in their heads, and completely different from what the teachers teaching in the school have in their heads, because they were students some time ago. And for discussions like this, even on national level or local level or school level, but also in European level, I think it would be very, very important to have at least secondary school students represented in the panel. This panel.
I'm going to come two separate responses, I think. Probably first to Jacky, because I think we would all agree that certainly the reflection in the UK and in English schools particularly is that there is a performance gap between those who are doing very well and continue to do very well and those who are at the other end of the rainbow. And that performance gap actually, funnily enough, is widening in England. It's getting bigger all the time, which is why perhaps in some of Peter's quotes and use of Ofsted data and information, one would think after 20 years of Ofsted and 7 cycles of inspection, you would think that with all that monitoring and inspection, things will be getting better, not worse. But I think part of the challenge and Jacky did refer to it, is that if we're going to have a will to change, then we do need to build capacity, and you need to build that leadership capacity in such a way that leadership needs to be in a good position, it needs to be resilient, it needs to be confident, and building what we know works, and Peter made this point, what we know works in terms of providing a successful education system and structure in a local community is where schools collaborate and work together. And it's working together, is to talk together, plan together, work together, culture that can be built within a school and between schools that brings the greatest success. And at the moment, certainly in England, the difficulty that we've got, I think, is that with a degree of the opposite case, which is competition, then competition breeds anything other than collaboration. And that's a divisive element, and that just does not help us. Jacky's comments, I think, about the sailing analogies, etc., but I feel a bit like the ancient mariner at times in this, because we're looking for a time when, over 40 years of working in teaching, we were always looking for a time when education would be top of the agenda politically. It has been so for the last 10 years in the UK and in other systems. Managing and dealing with it being at the top is actually bringing pressures, and bringing pressures for us all to be successful. But it's the over-competitive element and the lack of trust that's in the system, which I think at the moment is going to need some squaring. Peter is absolutely right to raise the issue that the quality of the school's leadership is paramount in the success for that school and that community. But if the quality of teaching and learning is not going to exceed that, if the leadership is at a low level, then what does it say about the quality of teaching in that school? So we have to look at how we empower schools to work together, to collaborate, and to raise the overall performance of all the schools. And in that way, I think we will get greater emphasis on one of the things you referenced, Peter, I think, which is progress that children make rather than just the raw attainment. So it's getting away from the raw attainment and teaching to the border zones and looking more at what does progress for all children look like. And that will hit, I think, Jacky's point about greater equity.
Yeah, I also like both the presentations, but for different reasons. Jacky's presentation, I think, was brilliant. It left me feeling unhappy. Because I liked what she said, the way she presented it. But the content of the presentation was not really what I wanted to hear. And I think that's a problem for us many times, that we don't want to hear what it's really about. She was talking about the values we have deep down. Most of the time when we describe the democratic value system or the welfare state, we answer politically correct. And the politically correct answers was not given by him. So I think this was very, very important for all of us to understand what she was really saying. That there is an attitude or a value system or deep grounded values. I don't want it is, and I hope it's not the deep grounded values, but it's maybe the attitudes. But those attitudes are there, and they hinder the growth of all students out in the schools. And I thought the tables you showed us really illustrated that. So thank you for doing that. And the question I have more or less to you is, what should we do to come around this? What kind of leadership do we need? Do we need, I don't think we need a distributed leadership. I think we need an ethical leadership, a leadership that covers the ethical aspects of schooling, and leadership that all the time is trying to enforce what's the ethical statement of teachers, principles, and so on. And maybe when you have some more people in your staff that you can trust that they are ethical in this respect. You can start distributing it. But in a sense, it's very sad. And I also like Peter's discussion, and I think I would like to emphasize two things in this presentation. You talked a lot about learning leadership, and you focused on learning in the organization, learning for both staff, teaching staff and other staff. I think if that should be possible, we also need to have learning leaders. And you didn't talk so much about that. So my question is, how can you support leaders to be learners? Because I don't think you can teach your staff, or you can work with learning among your staff if you are not a learner yourself. You have to be the prime learner if you're going to be a good principal. And I think we should emphasize that more in your speech. I also thought your table, when you showed that among the 100 best schools, it was almost everybody who had good leadership and so on, and then among the 100 not so successful schools, it wasn't good leadership. And I think this is also an important area for studying. What do we know about these basics? Is it the staff? Is it the culture? You talk a lot about the structure, but I think you have to combine structure and culture and leadership. And when you combine these, it's going to be quite interesting to talk about what's there. So I would like to see more focus of trying to understand, trying to explain the not so successful schools, because the others, they are okay, but what do we do, and what do we do as researchers to try to understand the not successful school leadership so better than today?
I represent ETUCE, the European Trade Union Committee for Education. And as I mentioned yesterday, we have adopted a policy paper on school leadership. Jacky linked discrimination of students to discrimination of staff. I think correctly so. And I would like to mention that one of the recommendations in our policy paper is about promoting policies to improve equitable access of women and men to leadership positions in schools and working conditions that make it possible to reconcile family and professional life. I think attracting the underrepresented sex to leadership positions could be a complicated matter if you also want to take merits into account. So I would like Jacky to expand a little on that, please. And when Peter made the observation that the English school leader associations and teachers' unions do not have much influence on government's policy decisions, I think I recognize that point of view from the 4 big teachers' unions, which are our members. They are normally very unhappy when we meet them and they tell us about the situation in particularly England. I think in many other countries there is a very constructive dialogue between governments or education ministers and the teachers' organizations, not in all countries, I will put it to you, yes. But the government, teachers' organizations and the school leaders' associations, or sometimes some of them. And at the European level, ETUCE has an extremely constructive dialogue and positive relation with the European Commission, and working together with the European Employers Federation, EFEE. I would like to ask you, Peter, could you expand a little more on why do you think the UK government is so reluctant to talk to the associations and teachers' unions, please? Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, and I suppose Jacky will start and then Peter continue.
Thank you very much indeed for all the thoughtful, insightful responses. Quite different, some of them. I don't want to speak at length because I think we need time for questions and comments from the floor. I'll try and respond briefly. I agree with some of the comments that have been made about how unhelpful the context is currently for leaders in terms of lack of autonomy, competition. But I also take from the comments, and as I said in my presentation, the real determination of policymakers to try to do something about this. The questions that have been asked are simple to state but so difficult to answer. How to break the cycle of complicity. Education has been a carrier of inequity for about 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, so I'm not going to find an answer in a sentence. But I think there are, in the panel's own comments, some hints as to what might be done. I'm not suggesting that some of the technical, more superficial in my mind, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but policy initiatives to do with the appointment process, the degree of autonomy, the structure of schools in a country, the nature of the curriculum and who has freedom to change it. All these things can be done. And I agree with you that assuring an appointment process which is genuinely meritocratic is a keystone, so that staff enact equity. If they don't, if students see that people from their own background are never appointed as teachers, what does that tell them about the nature of the school? So I do think the appointment process is important. Sometimes there are structures that make this very difficult, and they need to be dismantled. Parents. I make no apology for suggesting that parents, in some cases, are part of the problem. We know there is white flight and bright flight, where parents, in effect, put cultural pressure on schools to be seen as good when they have lots of economically advantaged students, and bad when they have students from poor backgrounds. How would you feel if your child was going to a bad school because it had poor children in it? I heard that word used in the conference, actually, a bad school. So parents are also part of the solution, in that I'm not suggesting for a moment that all parents are not committed to equity. Some are deeply committed to equity. But it would be sentimental and a PR job to suggest that all were. So I'm suggesting we need to work together to educate all parts of the community, including parents and learners, as well as teachers and leaders. Olof brilliantly summed up what I said in one sentence. Political correctness is not the truth. I thought that was wonderful. He asked what kind of leadership was needed, and he gave the answer himself: ethical leadership. The fashion at the moment is for distributed leadership. It's kind of chasing its way across Europe. But that does not, in my view, sufficiently address the issue of equity. I think leadership, whatever label you put on it, needs to focus centrally, persistently, over time, working with the whole community on equity. And maybe in the long term, as a result, we might get some change. I know I haven't addressed every single question, but I hope that's sufficient. Thank you.
Okay, some interesting questions there. Like Jacky, I will try very hard to be brief. I'm going to start with Jörgen's question about why the UK government has been so reluctant to engage in any kind of constructive dialogue with the professional associations. I think that's an interesting question, and I don't have the answer to that. But I would like to suggest that maybe it's because they're in a hurry, and consultation and debate very often slows you down. And as we know, politicians very often only have one bite of the cherry and they want to move quickly. I also intimated that there's a lack of trust in the professions and the professional associations, possibly the teacher associations more than the head teacher associations. I also think there's a tendency for politicians to talk about the importance of evidence-based policy and then to cherry-pick the evidence that supports what they want to do, and then they get on with it, saying the evidence is there to support what we're doing. So it's an interesting question, Jörgen. I think there needs to be the re-establishment and rebuilding of trust between the, if you like, the employers and the employees, which I think since the days of Margaret Thatcher, things have changed quite drastically. I'd like to pick up Olaf's point about the leaders need to focus very heavily on their own learning. I would endorse that entirely. And originally in my presentation, I had several slides that were talking about the head teacher as lead learner and the importance to role model and walk the talk and so on. I gave the evidence from the Robinson study that being involved and engaged in teacher learning and participating is the fundamental dimension of successful leadership. I've just been involved in some research in the UK, or England rather, looking at head teacher performance appraisal, and one of the things that we found in our research is that the professional development, the leadership development of head teachers themselves is very often sidelined, and governing bodies need to put this very much back on the agenda. Because if governing bodies are not encouraging head teachers to think about their own learning and development, then who else is? I think that's an important dimension. And in those learning-centred schools, leaders like others are very much concerned to demonstrate by example, which also rubs off on the students as well as fellow teachers. The head is doing his doctorate, for example. We've heard students say something along those lines. Olaf's other question was how can we explain the not-so-successful schools? And that links also, I think, to some of the other questions from Marc and also from Chris about collaboration and partnership and working together and supporting each other. Because we know that in schools that are not successful, the cultures of those schools are very often antithetical to that. And Chris made the point about how can we actually encourage collaboration when schools in England and in other systems are working very much in a competitive kind of mode. It is the basic contradiction between collaboration on the one hand, working together, supporting each other and so on, which has been demonstrated to be very successful in terms of improving schools and moving forward. And on the other hand, the competition where schools are competing with each other, particularly in big cities like London, because if you don't get the students coming through the gate, then obviously your income and hence the jobs of colleagues are at risk. So in my book, I actually use the phrase co-optation, which is a kind of combination between the two, because schools and school leaders are being asked to compete and yet collaborate. I think there is evidence of schools supporting schools, that it's working well. The whole notion of teaching schools, of which this government is wanting to have 500 or so in place by next year, these are very much schools that are working in collectives and teaching school alliances with others. It's a self-supporting school system, so that leaders in those schools are supporting other leaders, teachers in those schools, in these national support schools as they're also called, are supporting other schools. It's early days, yes, but the initial evidence is that this is a successful strategy for helping low-performing schools actually improve. And in terms of Eszter's comment about parents, I think that the English government, the policymakers, have tried very hard to ensure that parents are given information about the schools and given choice as to where they send the schools. where they send their children. All the research, however, shows that it's the schools that tend to select the children rather than the parents or the schools selecting parents or the children selecting the schools. But there is that information out there, and one of the roles of Ofsted has always been to provide information about the school that parents, or anybody for that matter, can directly access to see how well that school is performing. We now in England have an amazing amount of data about our schools that anybody, you or I, can access simply through their website. So, for example, we now have information about English schools about what is the average salary of the teacher working in that school. The salary of the head teacher is not publicly available at the moment, but I'm told that that's on its way. So soon we will know how much the head teacher earns as well as the average salary of teachers. Amazing amount of information that parents can access to help them make choices about where they want to send their children. And finally, Giovanna's question about inter and intra-school variability. I always find this a difficult one to fully grasp. In England, we are told, OEC data and other research, that the variability between teacher quality within a school is greater than the variability between one school and another. I find that hard to believe, but that apparently is the reality. And Giovanna's comment was, well, if the leadership style is such, then surely that that within school variability would be reduced. And I think the evidence suggests that it is being reduced. And we did some interesting, the National College did some interesting research into this very question a few years ago. And basically, in those schools, like the ones I was mentioning, that are learning-centred, where the leadership is very much focused on the learning, in those schools, that variability will be quite narrow, because those schools are trying to build on the best work and spread that across the whole school. And very often they're using students to get feedback on what actually helps with their learning. So I was talking to a colleague over coffee, and he was saying in this school, the children were asked about their learning preferences, and they made reference to the history department. And why can't the teachers in the maths department do what they do in history? Because that really helps with our learning. So it's about sharing what enhances learning and making that more common across the school as a whole. If there is best practice located within all our schools, what we're not good at is spreading and sharing that best practice so that it becomes the norm, so that it becomes common practice.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Jacky and Peter. Chris would like to continue. We have 2 microphones. We will leave one with a panel here, and after Chris it will be Eszter, and I will come down with this microphone. So, you have comments, questions? We use both microphones. Chris?
Yeah, I just want to build on something that Peter's referenced there, which is Ofsted, which is our inspection agency in England, as the providers of data and information. And it's the information side that actually not that many of us necessarily in schools recognise. And one thing that Ofsted do actually do is that's positive, entirely positive, is publish where they see best practice. And every month they provide an update which includes case studies of successful practice. And I only mention it here, far away from England, because if you want to go online and just Google Ofsted, you can hook up to that kind of practice and that kind of evidence base that's there. But if we're looking at culture within a school, then one of the best practice examples that they published is a school called Perry Bridges. I'll say it again slowly, Perry Bridges in Birmingham. And the culture in that school is such that, having come from being at the lowest level of performance of secondary schools in Birmingham, in the space of 4 years has transformed as a learning-centred culture where all the teaching staff are involved in undertaking MAs, and all the support staff working in the school are undertaking degrees or foundation degrees. And that's what I would describe as transformative leadership in terms of the school placing the school as a learning organisation. And that, I think, is a key cultural direction we should all be aiming for.
I would music to my ears when I hear they're all doing master's degrees. But I certainly would endorse that. But I think the key question, Chris, is how has that transformational change been brought about? And I would argue, and I'm sure you would agree, that that is very much down to the leadership of the organisation and the way that that leader or the leadership team, leaders more generally, are able to change that culture. I mean, Edgar Schein, the famous American professor, said many years ago that leadership, one of the most important things, if not the most important things that leaders do, is to change culture or to shape culture. He also said it's the most difficult thing that leaders do.
I think I didn't use my 3 minutes, that's why I was brave enough to say again. You were talking about the availability of information. I'm not familiar with the data Ofsted is offering on the public side, but I know that in many countries, like in my own country, the published data is about attendance to university right after graduation. And that's the first thing parents are checking and the community is checking about the school. And I think that the most important data or information cannot be made available in a statistical website for those who need help for equity most. Because, just to give a very simple example, we never measure how many of those students who are not going to university or any other kind of tertiary education right after maturate in my country will go to university. I went to a school when I was a secondary school student in ancient times. We were somewhere in the middle of the list. But in 3 years' time, everybody was at university, which was outstanding, but nobody measured it because it had a different kind of culture. And that kind of thing, and I think that is very, very important for those who need special help to reach the same potential, is nowhere, because it cannot really be measured. That's why I said that it's up to the school heads to do good PR for their own jobs.
Interesting observation. I mentioned earlier that the government in England is currently consulting over what should be performance indicators of schools. At the moment, schools publish information about pupil destinations, where do they go, university, jobs and so on, which is more problematic for primary school pupils, because where do they go? They normally go to high school. So that is an issue. But one of the suggestions in this consultation document is that schools give information about not only how many people go to university, but what kinds of universities they go to. We have a group of universities in England called the Russell Group, which are the elite universities like Oxford and Cambridge and some of the London colleges. So how many children from schools in poor areas are not only going on to higher education, but actually going to the top-notch universities? And that kind of information is now increasingly available, or will be, for parents, so that they can have more information about what schools are performing well.
Okay, thank you. We now have 3 people here amongst us down here. So we'll continue from here, and I suppose there are comments or questions to you, then hopefully you answer.
Thank you for all the contributions and presentations. I want to introduce another difficult question. Jacky pointed out that equity is everywhere in the network materials and dialogue, as it were, but also nowhere. I wanted to specifically focus on that and explore that and say something challenging about it. Of course, it's about equity and learning. So learning is another concept that is there in everything, and Peter has particularly focused upon that. But the question is, what is learning? Well, that question should be also something that is specifically and critically engaged with, because we can take for granted, or we appear to take for granted, that learning is what is measured by schools or by policymakers, but of course we can't do that. I'm mentioning about master's programmes, which I would support too, teachers and others having the opportunity to do master's programmes, but there are pressures upon master's programmes in the UK, I mean the UK, or master's level learning, which is something different from what we in the universities might consider master's level learning to be. So we have to critically engage with and articulate what learning is, what the capabilities are that we think ought to be addressed by schools and education, and the kind of experience that leads to, I would argue, the more rounded kind of person that education is about. So learning specifically, I would argue, needs to be on the agenda as a critical concept.
Thank you. Any response to that from the panel?
I agree absolutely, and I imagine we all on the panel agree that learning is central and critical, and we need to think more carefully about what we mean by it. At the start of my presentation, I referred to equity as relating to enabling learners to live a life they value. So I think particularly one of the aspects of learning that we need to be critical about is how we assess outcomes of learning. Our conversations have tended to slip between different kinds of achievement and attainment. Attainment is a very narrow way of understanding what learning is for, and most of the policy tends to measure impact in relation to attainment. Attainment may actually have nothing to do with learning. The research I mentioned in England talked to young people about what they thought learning was, and it was a very different understanding to the kind of thing they did when they went in a room and wrote an exam paper. So I think learning and equity are, as Philip is suggesting, totally and fundamentally linked, and we need to be critical about both, embedding them both in the practice of leadership and in policy more thoughtfully as we can in the future.
As a representative of one of the less trusted organisations representing teachers and principals, I have to say I think the analogy, the image, Jacky, is brilliant of the boat, and I think that because I do believe that there are currents and tides which kind of move us in a direction, whether we want it or not. And if I could characterise, Peter, your solution unfairly, I'm sure, within that image, it's like you're asking us to paddle harder and faster, you know. And it's almost because you point out that, you know, even though the objectives of education can be rigidly prescribed, that we still have the means to affect and empower the change that we want to bring there. But if the objectives of education are very narrowly and rigidly defined, and defined in terms of test scores in literacy and numeracy, then that presents us with a kind of education which depends on a notion of equality or on the notion of equality of opportunity, and then let everybody run and see who comes out the fastest. And the fat boy will always lose, as I pointed out to you earlier. So if you have this narrow thing, as a principal teacher, if you ask me what are the outcomes that I want for my children coming out of my school, I would like that they be happy, I would like them to be creative, I would like that they would be able to think critically and problem solve. I would like them to have high standards of literacy and high standards of numeracy. There are two things among a range of things, and I never see any outcomes, league tables on equality, league tables on creativity, league tables, because it's always narrowly defined. That said, I think I found the last slide that you presented, Peter, I can agree with absolutely everything on that. It is so positive as regards school leaders, and it is the way I like to think about school leaders. But I think there is a kind of positivity in the way, in your presentation, that it's almost like, you know, if we only work hard enough, we pull ourselves up by our shoelaces, these things don't matter. And I actually think that, unfortunately, they do matter. But you know, that's.
Thank you.
I accept exactly what you're saying, And in fact, I think what the panel members have been reflecting on also reflects what you're saying. You can't sweep the context aside. You can't forget the boat you're in and all its limitations. I agree completely on that. My point was that if we only focus on the boat, then we will not make any change. And we need to at least think about how we might do something about the tides and currents. My hope about presenting that particular argument in this forum is that here we have leaders and policymakers, and that is the point of this network, to bring together policymakers and leaders. It's policymakers that need to respond to some of your demands, to have the league tables on creativity, to have a much more insightful and careful understanding of what learning means and what living a life you value means. Until we get policymakers on board, we will continue to have to do what we have done as leaders and teachers for decades, which is paddle harder, in your phrase. We will paddle harder because that's what we do, because we care about the learners and their outcome, their fate. But you're right, that paddling will have limited effect until we can somehow get everybody to work in concert, focusing on this less narrow understanding of education and of what education should achieve. And there may be other people that, I keep forgetting to say this, so I'm going to say it, sorry. There is a paper that goes with the presentation, which is a fuller argument, and quite a number of references that will enable you to follow up on suggested actions. Please I'll put that on the portal, or if you give me your email, I'll send it to you.
Just a brief comment. It really links Philip Wood's question with your question, and that's I was talking about learning-centered leadership and leading the learning, but the key question that Philip and others are asking is learning for what? And essentially, we've had a very narrow, economic, deterministic definition of learning in terms of test scores and so on. And we're in an unfortunate position in my education system where some schools are deemed outstanding by our inspectors, but on closer analysis, they are little more than examination factories, not the kind of place that you or I would want to send our children. How they got outstanding status is another question, but there you go. But I do think it's incumbent not only on policymakers, but on all of us, and I include myself as a researcher, a professor, academic, that we should all be thinking about ways in which we can broaden those performance indicators so that we're actually measuring what we value rather than, the cliche about valuing that which could be easily measured. If we value creativity and those other things, and all of us would support that wholeheartedly, why haven't the professional associations, why haven't the universities, why haven't all of us actually come up with some ideas about how we move forward on that front? There are tests that measure creativity. There are tests that measure student self-concept. There are tests that measure citizenship and so on. All of those things are testable, but we haven't gone down that road to the extent that I think we should. And I blame ourselves for that because we haven't been driving it. I wrote to Ofsted about a decade ago saying that we've got performance indicators linked very much to attainment. What about progress? What about achievement in the round? Could you as an organisation, Ofsted, because you're so powerful and influential, could you not start talking about these other things and measure them? Their response was, we do look at these when we inspect schools, but schools do not report on the measures of creativity, on the measures of how happy our children are or whatever. Some schools in England increasingly are doing surveys, getting parental feedback, student feedback, staff feedback to say what a wonderful organisation we are to work in, a healthy organisation as opposed to a toxic one. And I think that's a move in the right direction. But to a large extent, I would say that that's partly our responsibility that we haven't pushed that debate further forward.
Jörgen from Estonia, I have got two comments. Both of you mentioned, and some of the panel members also, that there are poor families, but do you mean that the families are economically poor, mentally poor, socially poor, or emotionally poor? I personally think that if the family is only economically poor, it is not a big problem. Bigger problem when the family is mentally poor, socially poor or emotionally poor. But of course it is more difficult to find what is the main problem in the family. The second question is about equity, and just you mentioned that some students are least able, so understanding that there are better students and least able students. My understanding is that there are different students, and I yesterday also in the group I tried to explain that it is the most important to understand that students are different, not just higher and lower. And if we don't understand it, we have lost something very important. Thank you.
Anybody commenting from the
Just to say, I agree with you. My point was, it's how students are perceived as being less able. I agree with you completely.
Yeah, I think something I would add into it as well, and perhaps bring you in as to comment, is that when we know that actually postcode and the work and the job of your parents still, is the biggest predictor of your success of school, then it seems obvious that the more you can engage and empower and support parents to support their children at school, then the better the outcomes will be for all, for the child and for the parent. But I would pick up on, Peter, you referenced something really quite an important message, which is that if the Durham study did actually show, as your table indicated, what is it that makes the biggest difference to bringing about change in organisations? It isn't competition, it certainly isn't uniform, although your interesting point about academies, quite often the first thing academies do is they change the uniform, the very thing that has minimal impact and influence on changing the culture in the school. But, I can count on two thumbs the amount of parents who've not known, not wanted the best for their children at school, on starting school. And yet the very differences on children in early years starting school, it's very evident, even at the age of 4 or 5, which children, which families are going to struggle most. And the Durham study, I think I'm right in saying, we've got Dr. Ward here, so she's bound to nod or shake her head, but I think the Durham study said that the one thing that stands out more than anything else in terms of improving life chances and school chances, and that means building greater attention to equity, is a focused investment in early years. And early years in many countries is still not a statutory requirement, and it's the area which is the kind of the poor relation to the rest of the education system. So, if research is suggesting, informing, guiding policy, then it ought to be that we come flying in behind it and say, it's not just an outcome, it's something that we need to build completely into a sustained, focused investment on early years education.
Just a very brief reflection. I think that the European Union is starting to understand this question, and I have to tell you that I was very happy when I realized that it was DG Social that established the European platform for investing in children, which means that they have realized, and they are much richer than DG Education, of course. They have realized how important it is to really invest in children in early childhood education and care, and thus there might be a way of avoiding these currents that are under the ship.
I just wanted to make a brief comment on the relationship between policymakers and researchers, because I think that we are running a lot of risk in this very historical moment, at least in countries like Italy, but I suspect that this is the case also for other countries. Because it depends on what we mean with policymakers. We are very keen on identifying policymakers with specific tasks and specific intentions, but the reality is quite different. Because in fact, I can call myself a policymaker because I have been working in a ministry for a long time in quite a high position. So I am invited in committees, I express my opinion. But then the result of what we do is totally unpredictable. Not only because the practice is different, but because when it is enacted in the schools, but also because the government changes. And if I have to list all the policies I have been involved in, I would say that only 10% of them has come to the end of the process as it was foreseen in the beginning. So, of course, I could go on for hours to describe examples and the context, but the more I attend the international audiences, the more I understand that this situation is exactly the same in other countries, and even in England, that we always look at. In my research, I found that the head teachers, I did some research in England, and there was a strong complaint on the part of the head teachers about the unpredictability of the changes in the values and in the fundamental values of the policies from a year to another. So in this context, I think that these discourses we are making about equality, about sharing, about learning, and the way we break down these notions and we try to make sense of them are very important because they could create a culture. The stronger the culture is about these words and the differences, the differences between understanding learning, as he said before, in a certain way with respect to another. The more we produce materials, the more we simplify these notions and we break them down in projects like this, the more we create a binding culture for which, whatever policymakers, whatever adventure the policy needs, at least as educational professionals, we can be sure that certain values are there and that anybody would have the tools to criticize possible misunderstandings, and anybody could be blamed and shamed for, trying certain people.
Thank you. We do now, so we have 2 people from the audience, and we are running out of time, so we do take these 2 very quickly, and then we go to lunch.
Yes, I have a question for Jacky and Peter, actually. I was puzzled by Jacky's contribution in the sense that it was rhetorically brilliant, because I could disagree with you, but in the end, if I would say I would disagree, I would be put into the undertone currents. And then I thought, and that's the question, I'm not going to do what you ask. I'm a captain on a boat. If you make me responsible to reducing inequity, then it's what all societies do with education and educational schools. Education and schools as the result for every problem. We are living, like Madonna said, in an inequitable world. That's not going to change in the next 1,000 years. So what I would ask you also is, and Peter said something about it just in his contribution, I think that the academic profession would have to do a better job. We are talking here, and it's been at the start of this year in the project, on concepts that are fuzzy and are still fuzzy. Leadership, what is it? Equity, what is it? Outcome of school, what is it? My children went to university, and one of the first things they learned is conceptual rigor. So I would call upon you to do a better job. I've got the following studies for my job as a school leader. One study from the US says, the effect of school leaders on educational performance is only 10%. So why bother? One study in the Netherlands says they could not find any relation between leadership characteristics and perception of teachers of leadership and educational results. So why bother? The next study say that the results of schools is dependent more on pre-selection of students than on the effort of teachers. So all these inconsistent findings have to be brought together. I could live with different paradigms, but now it's kind of a mess. Could you please clear up the mess?
We are not going to do that. We don't have the time for that. I'm sorry, Olof, to you too. Paul will say exactly the last word.
My name is Johansson from Sweden. In a globalized world, we have to take into consideration a lot of minority cultures in our countries. And I think that's a topic we haven't touched upon, And I quote from Ken Leathwood's report on Alberta in Canada. School culture. Underperforming schools, districts and their staffs may be characterized by discontinuity between the dominant culture of the school and its staff and the culture of the home. An inability on the part of the school and its staff to meaningfully appreciate that culture and build on it for instructional purposes. This may reduce the quality of instruction for students from minority cultures. So, Jacky, what do you say about that?
I have just a short comment. We have been talking about leadership, we have been talking about the structures, but we also have students. And in many countries in Europe we have introduced free school choice, which means that students can go to another school. And I was just looking at the questionnaire results from Stockholm, and one of the prime reasons why students should try to get into upper secondary schools, different schools, was the entrance grades. So students are also selecting in that sense, and that they will do things like that. But the bad part of that selection process is that some schools will, because of that, be schools that are very difficult to have high learning results in. And I think that's the struggle we have to fight with them. That we have created a system that will have good schools and not so good schools, and how do we work with that?
We will end this session with this. I apologize. Something that I learned about dialogue is that it's discussion or changing opinions amongst people in equality and not trying to come to a final conclusion. We will continue with this discussion during lunch and during the day. Also, one reminder here, for this morning we selected a way of working like this, trying to really have a lot in a short time slot. And yesterday we worked with World Cafe with a different approach. What we will do in the future, it's like Jacky said, easy to say and difficult to do. I think we have to think a lot about that too. But thank you for the panelists now. Thank you for the audience. Sorry for not keeping the time better. And sorry for having to interrupt this for lunch. Thank you.